The man moved through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport the way most people do when they have spent 20 years learning not to be noticed. Quietly, efficiently, with the kind of controlled economy that speaks not of meekness but of discipline. His carry-on bag was compact, black, unremarkable. His jacket was a dark navy wool blazer over a plain white shirt. No tie, no badge, no insignia of any kind. His shoes were clean, but not new. He wore no watch that anyone would notice. His name was Marcus Jerome Calloway, and he was 47 years old, and he had traveled through this airport more times than he could count, and not once in all those years had he ever allowed himself to be rushed. He had arrived early. That was deliberate. He always arrived early. He liked airports in the quiet hour before the mid-morning surge, when the light through the terminal windows was still pale and the coffee was still fresh and the loudspeaker announcements had not yet taken on their frantic, overlapping quality. He had a coffee from a small stand near gate C-12, and he was reading something on his phone, and he was unbothered. He did not look like trouble. He did not feel like trouble. He was simply a man in an airport, waiting for a flight. None of that mattered to the two agents who had been watching him for 11 minutes. Agent Derek Mullen stood at the far end of the concourse with his arms crossed and his badge clipped to his belt in a manner that was clearly designed to be seen. He was 34 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw that carried permanent tension and eyes that moved with the quick, dismissive scan of a man who had decided the world could be sorted into categories and had long since stopped questioning which category he was sorting. Beside him, Agent Chris Favero was younger, quieter, less certain, but not certain enough in his uncertainty to say anything. He watched Mullen watch the man, and he said nothing. Mullen had made his assessment in the first 30 seconds. Black male, traveling alone, no suit jacket, no business laptop visible, boarding pass on a phone rather than printed. Sat down in the gate area before his flight was called for boarding. Kept looking at his phone. Didn't acknowledge the agents when they passed. That last part had bothered Mullen most. Most people, when they saw the badges and the jackets, either gave a nod of civic reassurance or looked away with the studied neutrality of someone who had nothing to hide but preferred not to engage. This man had done neither. He had simply continued reading whatever he was reading, as if the agents were not there at all, as if their presence registered no differently than the coffee stand or the trash bin or the moving walkway humming past the terminal windows, as if they were simply part of the environment. Mullen found that intolerable. He pushed off the wall and walked toward the gate area with the kind of stride that announced itself before it arrived. Calloway heard the footsteps. He did not look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading. Then he looked up, and his face was composed, entirely composed, the way a man's face is composed when it has been composed under much greater pressure than this. "Sir." Mullen stopped close. Too close. The distance was intentional. "Can I see some identification?" Calloway set his phone on his knee, screen down. He looked at Mullen. He looked at Favero, who had positioned himself at a slight angle and to the left, the way agents are trained to do when they want to establish a presence without technically blocking egress. He looked back at Mullen. "Good morning," Calloway said. "ID, sir. Can I ask what this is about?" "Standard compliance check." Mullen's voice carried the specific flatness of someone who used procedural language as a weapon, someone who understood that vague, bureaucratic phrasing made resistance seem unreasonable. "ID, please." Calloway reached slowly into the interior pocket of his blazer. He was deliberate about it. Years of training and years of living as a black man in America had layered that deliberateness so deep into his muscle memory that he could not have rushed the motion if he'd tried. He produced a standard driver's license and held it out. Mullen took it. He looked at it. He turned it over. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Calloway. He looked at the photograph again. Then he looked at Calloway with an expression that communicated nothing specific but conveyed everything about his intent. "Marcus Calloway," he read aloud. "Atlanta address." "That's correct. And where are you headed today, Mr. Calloway?" "Washington, D.C. Business or personal?" The pause Calloway allowed before answering was less than a second. But it was there, and Favero noticed it, and he filed it somewhere in the back of his mind and didn't know what to do with it. "Personal," Calloway said. "Who are you visiting?" "I'm not sure that's a required disclosure for a domestic flight." Mullen tilted his head. The slight movement was the closest thing to warmth he was capable of manufacturing, and it contained none. We have the authority to conduct document verification and conduct inquiries in federal airport facilities. If you don't want to answer, that's your right. But it's going to make this take longer." He paused. A lot longer. The gate around them was filling. Other passengers had begun to notice. A woman with 2 young children glanced over and then looked away quickly. A man in a business suit slowed his walk, assessed the scene in a half-second, and accelerated past. An elderly white couple paused at the row of seats on the opposite side of the aisle and sat down with the careful, practiced air of people who wanted to pretend they weren't watching. Calloway looked at Mullen with an expression of such precise neutrality that it might have been carved. "I'm visiting family," he said. "Name and address of the family member." "I don't have that memorized." "You don't know the address of the family you're visiting?" "I have it in my phone." "Can I see your phone?" "No." The single syllable fell like a stone. Mullen's jaw tightened. The posture of the exchange had shifted microscopically, but unmistakably. He handed the driver's license to Favero without looking at him. "Run it," he said. Favero pulled a device from his jacket and began typing. Calloway watched the process with the same impenetrable calm. His coffee sat on the seat beside him, half finished, still faintly steaming. His carry-on bag was between his feet. His hands were on his knees. He was not performing patience. He was simply patient. "You travel frequently?" Mullen asked, filling the silence. "Yes." "For work?" "Sometimes." "What kind of work do you do?" Calloway looked at the gate agent behind the counter, who was watching with barely concealed discomfort, pretending to sort papers. He looked at the growing cluster of passengers who were now, unavoidably, aware of what was happening in their midst. A young black woman 2 rows over had stopped scrolling her phone entirely and was watching with an expression that Calloway recognized because he had seen it 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts. The particular mixture of solidarity and dread that comes from watching something familiar unfold in public. "I work for the federal government," Calloway said. Mullen processed this. He did not alter his expression. "Department. I'd prefer to discuss that privately if this conversation is going to continue." "We can arrange that." Mullen's tone made it clear that arranging it would not be a courtesy. "We have a room just down the concourse." "I know where the room is," Calloway said. Mullen stopped. Just for a fraction of a second, something crossed his face and then left it. Not suspicion exactly. More like the faintest scratch on glass, barely visible, not yet a crack. "Then you know it would be better to cooperate here," Mullen said. "I haven't been uncooperative. You've refused to answer questions. I've declined to volunteer information I'm not legally obligated to provide. That's different." Favero came back. He handed Mullen the device. He leaned in slightly and said something very quietly. Mullen looked at the screen. He looked at it for longer than the initial read should have required. Something in his eyes did something that Favero would later describe, in a conference room under oath, as a kind of flicker. Then Mullen reset his face into its default configuration and looked back at Calloway. "The system is showing some flags on your file," Mullen said. Calloway did not move. "What kind of flags?" "That's what we need to sort out." "In the room." "What kind of flags?" Calloway repeated. His voice had not changed in pitch or volume, but something in the texture of it had become denser, more deliberate, the way a river looks the same on the surface above a current change. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us." "Am I being detained?" "We're asking you to come voluntarily." "Am I being detained?" Calloway said again, and this time it was not a question with the same weight as the first. This time it was a line being drawn in language, a boundary articulated with the full understanding of what came next. Mullen looked at him. "Yes," he said. "You are." Calloway stood. He was taller than Mullen had accounted for. Not dramatically so, but enough. He picked up his carry-on bag and his coffee. He put the coffee in a nearby trash receptacle with the same deliberate care he'd applied to every motion since the agents approached. He did not look at the other passengers, though he was aware of all of them. He walked with Mullen and Favero down the concourse toward the federal compliance room. He did not say a word. The room was what it always was. A rectangle with fluorescent light and a metal table and chairs that offered no comfort by design. There was a two-way mirror on one wall, though no one was visible behind it. The door closed with a click that felt heavier than the door itself. Mullen sat across from Calloway. Favero stood near the door, tablet in hand, not meeting anyone's eyes. Mullen had a folder now. He opened it on the table between them. Inside was a printout that Calloway could not fully read from where he sat, but could partially make out. And what he could make out told him that the system flag had been generated by a recently entered watchlist cross-reference that should not have produced a match on his name, and absolutely would not have produced a match on his name if someone at the field office level had bothered to check the clearance tiers of the individuals whose names they were running through a watchlist system designed for undocumented migrant trafficking networks. This indicates, Mullen began, that your name appears in a flagged communication database. That would be an error, Calloway said. The system doesn't make errors. Every system makes errors. That is the literal definition of why review processes exist. We can determine that through the proper channels. How long will that take? Could be a few hours. Could be longer. Calloway's flight was in 45 minutes. Both of them knew this. Whether Mullen knew it from looking at the boarding pass he'd photographed or simply from reading the gate number, Calloway didn't know. It didn't matter. I'd like to make a phone call, Calloway said. You can do that. You're not under arrest. I know I'm not under arrest. I'd like to make a phone call. Go ahead. Calloway produced his phone. It was a standard-issue government-grade encrypted device, indistinguishable in appearance from a civilian handset, unless you knew the specific indicators on the back panel and the interface. Mullen did not know those indicators. Favero did not know those indicators. Calloway unlocked it. He found a contact listed simply as ASACATL, the resident agent in charge of the Atlanta field office. He pressed call. He waited. The line connected on the second ring. This is Calloway, he said. I'm in detention at Hartsfield-Jackson, Terminal C Federal Compliance Room. 2 agents, Mullen and Favero. There's a system flag error on my profile. I need it resolved in the next 30 minutes. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sir, said the voice on the other end. And the word carried a weight that Favero heard from across the room. The word was not the compressed, bureaucratic sir of subordinate to supervisor professional courtesy. It was the full, dropping weight of a man who had just understood something that rearranged the immediate architecture of his world. Resolve the flag, Calloway said, and get someone on the line with the supervising officer. He ended the call. He set the phone on the table. He looked at Mullen. Mullen was looking at the phone. Who did you just call? Mullen said, the Atlanta field office. In what capacity? Calloway said nothing. Mullen's confidence was still present. It was still the dominant thing in the room. But it had acquired, for the first time, a texture of something else. Not doubt. Not yet. Something closer to the feeling a man gets when he steps onto ice and hears a sound that is not quite a crack, but is not quite not one either. Mr. Calloway, Mullen said, and his voice had shifted almost imperceptibly toward the formal, a retreat from the casual authority he had been deploying. I need to ask you again about your federal employment. What department did you say? I didn't say. I'm asking now. The knock on the door came before Calloway could answer. It was a single knock, 2 beats, and it was sharp. Mullen turned. Favero opened the door. The man standing in the doorway was Agent Supervisor Richard Baird, the Field Operations Director for ICE's Atlanta Hub, a 23-year veteran who had seen nearly everything this work could produce and who was currently experiencing, based on his expression, something in the category of things he had not previously seen. Behind him was a woman in a dark suit with a DHS credential hanging from a lanyard, and behind her was a uniformed TSA supervisor. And none of the 3 people in that doorway looked the way people look when they are arriving to affirm a decision. They looked the way people look when they are arriving to undo one. Baird stepped into the room. He looked at Mullen. He looked at Favero. He looked at Calloway. Then he looked at Mullen with an expression that Favero would later describe as the quietest version of devastation he had ever witnessed on a human face. Agent Mullen, Baird said, step outside with me. Sir, we have an active detention based on a system flag and a refusal to step outside with me right now. The room was very still. Favero looked at his shoes. Calloway looked at nothing in particular. His hands were flat on the table. His breathing was steady. Mullen stepped outside. The door closed. Through the closed door, nothing was audible except the faint, controlled rhythm of voices that were being kept quiet specifically because of what they were saying. Favero stood near the window. The fluorescent light hummed. The woman in the dark suit, who had remained in the room, stood in the corner with her arms at her sides and looked at the wall above Calloway's head and appeared to be focusing very hard on remaining invisible. The door opened again. Baird came back in alone. Mullen was not behind him. Baird stood in front of the table. He cleared his throat. He looked at the man sitting across the metal table in the plain navy blazer and the clean, unremarkable shoes, and he said, "Sir, I sincerely apologize for this situation. The system flag is being cleared right now. It was generated by a data entry error in a field office cross-reference 3 weeks ago that should have been caught during standard review and was not." He stopped. He gathered himself. "We will ensure you make your flight." Calloway looked at him. "Sit down, Richard." Baird sat, and in responding to the first name address without any trace of offense or correction, he completed the confirmation of something that had been building in the room since the call was placed. He did not call Calloway by any title. He did not need to. Every person left in that room now understood that the man in the plain navy blazer was not a man to whom apologies of this kind were usually delivered, and that the act of delivering one here was an act of considerable institutional weight. Favero's tablet was in his hand, and his hand was at his side, and his hand had stopped moving entirely. "Tell me what happened," Calloway said. Not angrily, not with the ceremonial cadence of authority performing itself. Simply as a man who wanted information and was accustomed to receiving it accurately. Baird told him. The field unit had been operating a heightened compliance initiative for the past 2 weeks under a new directive issued by the regional office. Agents had been given expanded discretionary latitude for document verification in high-traffic transit hubs. The initiative had been designed, on paper, to address trafficking networks that used domestic air corridors for internal movement. In practice, the discretionary latitude had been applied unevenly. Complaints had been filed. The complaints had not been processed. The data entry error that generated the system flag on Calloway's name was real, but it was the smallest part of what Baird was describing. The largest part was the pattern underneath it. Calloway listened. He did not interrupt. When Baird finished, Calloway looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked at Favero, who had not moved since Baird returned. "You're Favero," Calloway said. "Yes, sir." "Did you have concerns about this stop?" It was not a question, exactly. It was something more precise. Favero looked at Baird, and then looked back at Calloway, and swallowed once. "I did," Favero said. "I wasn't sure I had grounds to write it down," Calloway said. "Everything you remember about this morning, from the point Agent Mullen first identified me as a subject to this moment. Every word, every decision point, every instruction he gave you, and every concern you had. You will submit that to the OIG office in Atlanta. Today." Favero nodded. His face had the pale, drained quality of a man who had been standing near something without fully understanding its proximity to him. "Where is Mullen now?" Calloway said to Baird. "Outside. He's been asked not to go anywhere." "He hasn't been told who I am?" "Not explicitly." Calloway nodded once. "I want him brought back in." Baird opened the door and spoke to someone outside it. A moment passed. Then Mullen entered. Whatever Mullen had been told in the hallway, it had been enough to perform a visible recalibration in his bearing. He was still upright. He still had the physical presence he'd walked in with. But the commanding looseness of his earlier manner was gone, replaced by a careful, metered quality, the way a man walks when he is suddenly aware of the ground beneath his feet. He looked at Calloway. Calloway let the silence last exactly long enough. "Sit down, Agent Mullen." Mullen sat. "I want to be very precise with you," Calloway said, "because I think precision is important. I think it is the single most important attribute of the kind of work you and I are both engaged in. Imprecision gets people hurt. Imprecision loses cases. Imprecision destroys institutions from the inside over the course of years, while everyone inside those institutions tells themselves they're doing the work correctly." He paused. He let Mullen sit with it. "You approached me based on an observation. You made a determination that I warranted investigation based on criteria you applied in less than 30 seconds. I want you to tell me, out loud, in this room, what those criteria were." Mullen's jaw was working. "The flag in the system. You ran my ID after you approached me," Calloway said. "Tell me what made you approach me." The room was absolutely quiet. Even the fluorescent light seemed to dim its hum. "Behavioral indicators," Mullen said. "You were in the gate area alone. You were not responsive to our presence. I was not responsive to your presence. You didn't acknowledge us." Calloway looked at him for a long time. "How many passengers in that gate area did you approach?" Mullen did not answer. "How many?" Calloway said again. Mullen breathed. One. Calloway repeated the word with the care of a surgeon making a precise incision. Out of an entire gate area of passengers who were sitting alone, who did not acknowledge you, who were traveling to Washington. 1. The silence that followed was the kind that does not need filling, because what it contains is already complete. "I am Marcus Jerome Calloway," he said. His voice was level. It carried no triumphalism. It carried no performance of revelation. It was simply a statement of fact being made to a man who needed to understand all of its implications. "I am the director of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. I have served in federal law enforcement for 22 years. I have overseen 6 major investigations into civil rights violations within immigration enforcement. I am traveling today on personal time, with a valid boarding pass for a domestic flight, without my credentials, without my security detail, without any marker of my professional identity, because I am a citizen of this country and I travel in it as a citizen. The way every person in that gate area travels. The way every person you did not approach travels." He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He remained seated in the posture he had held since the beginning, hands flat on the table, back straight, face composed. "What happened this morning," he continued, "will be reviewed in full. The flag error will be traced and corrected, and every case in which that error produced a stop or a detention will be examined. The compliance initiative your unit has been operating under for the past 2 weeks will be suspended pending a full audit. The complaints that were filed and not processed will be reopened. And what happened to me this morning will become the evidentiary centerpiece of a Department of Justice inquiry into the practice guidelines your field unit has been operating under." He stood. He was unhurried. He straightened his jacket. "You are not being placed under arrest today. You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation. Do not travel. Do not contact any witness or colleague involved in this morning's events. Do not access any departmental systems. Supervisor Baird will issue the formal paperwork within the hour." He picked up his carry-on bag. He looked at Mullen one more time. "The system flag in my file," he said, "was an error. What you did with it was not." He walked to the door. The woman in the dark suit opened it for him. They walked together into the concourse. Outside, the airport moved with its ordinary, indifferent energy, passengers and announcements, and rolling luggage and coffee steam. And through it all, Calloway moved with the same quiet economy he had carried in 2 hours ago. But now Baird was beside him, and the woman in the dark suit was on his other side, and a TSA supervisor was clearing a path to the gate, and the gate agent looked up when Calloway arrived and said, "Mr. Calloway, we've held the boarding. We're ready whenever you are." And the way she said it was different from the way gate agents speak to ordinary travelers, in a way that was not about politeness and was not about ceremony, but was about the specific gravity of understanding, finally, what she was looking at. Calloway thanked her. He boarded. He found his seat, a window seat because he always chose window seats, and he sat down and put his bag in the overhead and took out his phone and did not look at it immediately. He looked out the window at the tarmac, at the ground crew moving with their orange batons, at the gray morning sky beginning to lighten towards something that was not quite blue. He thought about the young woman in the gate area who had stopped scrolling her phone to watch. He thought about what her face had carried. He did not know her name. He did not know where she was going. But he knew what she had seen, and he knew what she had recognized in it. And he knew that the distance between what she felt in that moment and what he felt in this one was exactly the distance between a man with a credential and a man without one, and that this distance should not exist, and that the work of his next several months would be, in part, about making it smaller. The plane pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway, and Calloway opened his phone and began to write the first of what would become 16 separate memos. Back in the compliance room at Terminal C, Derek Mullen sat alone. Baird had instructed him to remain until the administrative leave paperwork could be formally transmitted, and so he remained, in the room where he had sat across from the director of the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties of the Department of Homeland Security, and explained that the man had warranted investigation because he had not acknowledged him. He sat with this. He had, over the course of his 9-year career, accumulated a specific kind of confidence in his own judgment. It had been constructed across 1,000 small confirmations, a detained subject who turned out to have an outstanding warrant, an intercepted document that proved a connection, a stop that yielded exactly what he had predicted it would yield. He had built a professional identity on the architecture of his instincts, and his instincts had been praised, and he had been promoted, and the praise and the promotion had each functioned as additional confirmation, a closed loop of validation that had grown so tight over time that nothing from outside it had been able to get in. He thought about the man's face, the extraordinary stillness of it, the precision of the language, the complete absence of surprise when the door opened and Baird came back in. He had not been surprised. Not at any point. He had sat in the room as if he already knew every step of what was coming and had decided simply to let it arrive. Mullen understood now what that stillness was. It was not the stillness of someone suppressing panic or performing dignity under pressure. It was the stillness of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to exist in rooms like this one, to survive the kind of moment that Mullen had just created, and who had arrived at a place so far beyond surprise that even the worst version of the moment landed on the smooth, impenetrable surface of everything he already knew about what this world was capable of. Mullen put his badge on the table. He didn't know why he did it. No one had asked him to. Baird had told him he was on administrative leave, not that he was surrendering his credentials. But the weight of it on his belt suddenly felt like something he needed not to be carrying, and he set it down on the metal table and looked at it, and felt the absence of it in a way he had not anticipated. The door opened. Baird came back in. He looked at the badge on the table. He looked at Mullen. He sat down. He placed a form in front of Mullen. He said, "This is the administrative leave notice. You'll sign here and here." He pointed to 2 lines. "Your union representative has been notified. OIG has already opened a file." Mullen signed. His hand moved across the page with the automaticity of a body continuing to function while the self inside it sat somewhere further back, quieter, adjusting. "There's something else," Baird said. He set a second document next to the first. "This is the complaint log from the past 14 days. Your unit's activity. It's been submitted to the DOJ as part of the audit request." Mullen looked at the document. There were names on it, dates, stops and detentions, and verification requests. 51 and 14 days. He scanned the list. The demographic breakdown, printed in a small table at the upper right corner of the summary page, showed what the stops had looked like, who had been stopped, what the outcomes had been, how many had produced any legitimate enforcement action. 11. 11 out of 51. He had always known these numbers, in the way that people know things they have chosen not to examine directly. Seeing them printed on a formal document, formatted with the clinical precision of official government record-keeping, was a different kind of knowing. It was the kind that stays. "You're free to go," Baird said. "Don't leave the city." Mullen stood. He did not take the badge. Baird watched him leave the badge. He did not say anything about it. The investigation that followed was not the kind that are televised in real time, though parts of it would eventually become public in ways that were harder to contain than its architects initially anticipated. It began with Callaway's 16 memos, each addressed to a different supervisory or oversight body, each precise in its identification of the specific procedural failure it documented, and together forming a portrait that was not primarily about one morning in one airport, but about a pattern that had been built over time, quietly, in the gap between written policy and actual practice. The DOJ Civil Rights Division opened a formal inquiry within 48 hours. The inquiry subpoenaed 22 months of stop-and-detention records from the Atlanta ICE field hub. The data analysis, conducted by a team from the Civil Rights Division's Data Analytics Unit, produced a report that ran to 214 pages and whose central findings were not surprising to anyone who had been watching, but were devastating in their specificity. The statistical disparity in enforcement actions across racial lines was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was not a case that required expert testimony to establish correlation. The numbers spoke with the flat, unanswerable authority of numbers, and what they said was that the compliance initiative had operated, in practice, as an instrument of targeted racial enforcement, regardless of what it had been designed to say on paper. The field operations director who had issued the expanded discretionary latitude directive was a man named Gerald Costas, 28 years in federal law enforcement, 3 commendations, the kind of record that makes institutions slow to look at what is underneath it. He was interviewed on the 4th day of the inquiry. He arrived with a lawyer and delivered prepared answers, and spent most of the session describing the legitimate enforcement purpose of the initiative and the importance of giving field agents the tools they needed to respond to emerging threats. The investigator conducting his interview, a deputy assistant attorney general named Priya Mehta, listened to all of it and then asked him to look at a single page she placed in front of him. The page showed the 51 stops from Mullen's unit broken down by the time of day, the terminal, the demographic characteristics of the individuals stopped, and the enforcement outcomes. She asked him to explain the disparity. He consulted with his lawyer. He gave an answer about statistical variance in enforcement populations and the difficulty of drawing causal conclusions from aggregate data. Mehta wrote something on her notepad. She did not look up when she wrote it. Costas was placed on administrative leave 6 days after Mullen. The regional director above Costas, a political appointee named James Whitfield, who had issued the broader enforcement philosophy that had filtered down into Costas's initiative and further down into Mullen's practice, learned of the investigation on day 3. He called 2 senators whose offices had historically been sympathetic to his agency's funding requests. He had a conversation with a senior staff member at the department's public affairs office. He made 3 calls to colleagues at the agency's headquarters that would later be documented in phone records subpoenaed as part of the investigation. None of these calls were able to stop what was happening because the person whose name sat at the center of what was happening held a position of sufficient authority that the normal gravitational pull of institutional self-protection could not bend the trajectory of the inquiry toward him. Whitfield was interviewed on day 9. He did not bring a lawyer. He would later explain this decision as an expression of confidence that he had nothing to hide. The investigators found this interesting. The first press report appeared on day 11. It was a brief item in a legal affairs publication with a small readership, citing anonymous sources describing a DOJ inquiry into ICE field operations in Atlanta following an incident involving a senior DHS official. By day 13, it had been picked up by 3 major national outlets. By day 15, it was on every front page. The narrative that emerged in the press was not precisely accurate in its details, because early press narratives rarely are, but it was accurate in its structure, in the way a sketch is accurate before it becomes a painting. A black federal official, 2 ICE agents, an airport detention, a pattern beneath the incident, an investigation that was larger than the incident that triggered it. The public response was significant and was not, at its core, about the specific identity of the man who had been detained. This was a point that Callaway himself made in the one official statement he released through the DHS Communications Office 12 days after the incident. The statement was brief. It noted that the systemic issues identified in the investigation predated the incident and affected individuals who did not have the institutional resources or professional protections available to a senior federal official. It called for the findings of the investigation to be applied to the development of new, enforceable, independently monitored practice guidelines for civil rights compliance in immigration enforcement operations. It did not use the word justice. It did not use the word accountability. It did not use any of the words that public statements in these situations routinely deploy as substitutes for action. It used the word enforcement 3 times, in the literal administrative sense. The statement was read carefully by people who understood what it was doing. The formal charging decisions came 22 weeks after the incident, on a Tuesday in November, in a federal district court in Atlanta. Mullen and Favero were charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Costas was charged with civil rights conspiracy under Section 241 and with obstruction for the phone calls he had made during the investigation. Whitfield was charged with civil rights conspiracy and with 2 counts of witness interference. The charges were read in open court. Mullen's lawyer entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. Costas's lawyer did the same. Whitfield, who appeared in court in a charcoal suit and carried himself with the residual bearing of a man who had not yet fully accepted the translation of his circumstances, entered a not guilty plea that the courtroom reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution noted was delivered in a quieter voice than the room would have expected. Favero had cooperated with the investigation from the beginning, as Callaway had instructed. He had submitted his written account on the day of the incident. He had provided testimony voluntarily. He had identified additional incidents he had witnessed over the preceding months that formed part of the evidentiary pattern. He was offered a deferred prosecution agreement and accepted it, with conditions including mandatory retraining, extended probationary supervision, and the formal requirement to provide testimony at trial if called. The trial of Mullen and Costas began in the first week of March, 7 months after the detention at Hartsfield-Jackson. It was covered extensively. The presiding judge was a woman named the Honorable Constance M. Abernethy, who had been on the federal bench for 14 years and whose courtroom was known for a quality of procedural rigor that left little room for performance and less room for delay. Calloway testified on the third day of trial. He arrived without a security detail. He wore a dark gray suit and a plain tie. He was sworn in with the same composed economy he applied to everything. He answered questions directly and precisely and did not elaborate beyond what was asked. He described what had happened at the airport with the same attention to concrete detail, setting, gesture, tone, sequence that he had applied to his written memos, and the effect in the courtroom was the same effect those memos had produced in the investigators who first read them, the quiet, accumulative weight of facts precisely arranged. Under cross-examination, Mullen's defense attorney, a methodical and experienced lawyer named Gareth Platt, suggested that the detention had been procedurally appropriate given the system flag on Calloway's file, regardless of the error's origin. He asked Calloway whether a reasonable agent, encountering a system flag on an individual's record, would have been derelict in duty not to follow up on it. Calloway agreed that a reasonable agent following up on a system flag would not have been derelict. He was then asked whether, setting aside the flag, the initial approach was nonetheless consistent with appropriate enforcement discretion. Calloway looked at Platt for a moment. The flag was run after the approach, Calloway said. Agent Mullen approached me before he had any system-generated reason to do so. The question you're asking is premised on an inversion of the sequence of events. Platt paused. He looked at his notes. No further questions, he said. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned guilty verdicts on all primary counts against Mullen and Costas. The obstruction counts against Costas were returned guilty on the second and third counts and not guilty on the first. Whitfield's trial was severed and scheduled for 2 months later. He would eventually accept a plea agreement that included a guilty plea to 1 count of civil rights conspiracy, a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, a permanent bar from federal employment, and the forfeiture of his federal pension. Mullen received a sentence of 26 months in federal prison, 2 years supervised release, and a permanent revocation of his federal law enforcement credentials. Costas received 34 months, 3 years supervised release, permanent revocation of credentials, and a fine. On the day of sentencing, Judge Abernethy addressed the courtroom before announcing the terms. She did not make a speech. She did not deliver a sermon. She described the specific harm documented in the case, the people who had been stopped without legitimate justification, the dignity violations that had accumulated across months of documented enforcement practice, the institutional failure that had allowed these practices to persist and had moved to silence complaints rather than address them. She described the function of the law under which the defendants had been convicted, which was not designed for ordinary error, but for the use of governmental authority to deprive individuals of their constitutional rights. She said that what had been documented in this case was not the result of a rogue agent acting alone. She said the evidence showed a pattern enabled by supervisory indifference and managerial design, and that the sentencing reflected not only individual culpability, but the court's recognition that accountability in these cases required naming the structure and not only the person inside it. She imposed sentence. The courtroom was not theatrical. No one cheered. No one wept dramatically. There was the subdued, serious quality of a room in which something heavy had been set down after being carried for a very long time, and everyone present could feel the difference in the air. In the back of the courtroom sat 7 people who had been detained by Mullen's unit during the 14-day compliance initiative. They had been contacted by investigators, and their cases had been reviewed, and their records had been cleared. 3 of them had since filed civil suits, for had provided victim impact statements to the court. One of them was a man named Robert Adeyemi, 41 years old, a dual citizen of the United States and Nigeria, a software engineer from Marietta, Georgia, who had been detained for 3 hours on his way to a conference in Houston 2 days before Calloway's incident, and who had missed the conference, and who had been told when he asked the reason for his detention that there were questions about his documentation that needed to be resolved. His documentation had been entirely in order. Adeyemi had not gone to the press. He had not made a complaint through official channels. He had done what a great many people do in the aftermath of an experience like his. He had filed it somewhere interior and continued. He had not expected anything to come of it. He had not expected to be sitting in this courtroom 7 months later. When the sentencing was finished and the room began to empty, Adeyemi sat for a moment longer. He looked at the empty witness stand. He looked at the flag in the corner. He looked at the seal above the judge's bench. He was not thinking about the verdict. He was thinking about his daughter, who was 9 years old, who had asked him when he came home from Houston, except he had never made it to Houston, and he had told her there had been a problem with his flight, and she had accepted this because she was 9, and because children accept the explanations adults give them when those adults are protecting them from the weight of truth. And he had sat with her that evening and helped her with her homework and thought, as he had thought many times since, about what he was going to tell her someday about what this country was and how to move through it and how to love it anyway, which was the most complicated love there was, the love of a place that had not always loved you back. He stood. He put on his coat. He walked out of the courtroom into the hallway and then out through the building's glass doors into the November air. Calloway did not attend the sentencing. He had been in Washington on the day it took place, in a hearing before a congressional subcommittee, testifying about the proposed revisions to the Civil Rights Compliance Framework for Immigration Enforcement Operations. The hearing lasted 4 hours. He answered every question with the same precision he applied to everything. He was asked several times whether the Atlanta incident had been the catalyst for the proposed reforms, and each time he answered in the same way. He said the reforms had been under development for years, and the incident had accelerated their visibility but had not created the need for them, because the need for them had existed long before a senior DHS official had been detained in an airport, and would have continued to exist if the person detained had not been in a position to do what he had subsequently done about it. The subcommittee chair, a senator from Ohio, pressed him on this point. He asked whether Calloway was concerned that the reforms might be perceived as being primarily about protecting high-ranking officials rather than ordinary citizens. Calloway looked at the senator. He took a measured breath. "Senator," he said, "the man who was detained in Atlanta in September was a federal official, yes. But the reason a federal official was detained is the same reason 50 other people were detained in the 2 weeks before him. The same assumptions, the same practices, the same absence of accountability. The difference is that I had the ability to respond to my detention in a way that those 50 people did not. That asymmetry is the problem. The proposed framework is an attempt to reduce it. The goal is not to protect officials. The goal is to make the system work the same way for every person moving through it." He paused. "That is what equal protection means," he said. "Not that no one gets stopped. That everyone who gets stopped has a reason behind the stop that can survive scrutiny. A documented, defensible, constitutional reason. That's the standard. It is not a complicated standard. It is the standard this country committed to establishing in law. The question before this committee is not whether that standard is desirable. It is whether we are prepared to enforce it." The senator wrote something down. Several other committee members also wrote something down. The hearing room was quiet in the way that hearing rooms are rarely quiet, which is to say attentively, with the particular quality of attention that a room gives to a statement that it recognizes, however belatedly, as true. The revised compliance framework passed out of committee 2 months later and was signed into law. In the following spring, it established mandatory recording requirements for all civil enforcement stops, independent oversight boards with real subpoena authority in each of the 10 federal enforcement regions, a civil rights clearinghouse for complaints that operated outside the jurisdictional control of the agencies being complained about, and a set of enforceable standards for the demographic auditing of enforcement patterns with mandatory public reporting. It was called the Equitable Enforcement Accountability Act. It was not named after anyone. Calloway had specifically requested that no element of it bear his name. On the morning the law was signed, Calloway was in his office in Washington. He had been in the building since 6:30. He had a coffee on his desk, plain, no sugar. He was reading the final enrolled text of the legislation on a printed copy, which was his habit, reading important documents in print because something about the density of the paper made precision easier, made error harder to overlook. He read it from the first section to the last. He found two places where the language was not quite as tight as he would have made it, and he noted them in the margin for future regulatory clarification. He found the sections he had fought hardest for over 6 months of negotiation and amendment and counter-amendment, the Oversight Board Authority, the data reporting mandates, and he felt, for each of them, the particular satisfaction of something built correctly after long effort, the satisfaction not of winning but of finishing. He thought about a gate area in Atlanta on a September morning. He thought about a man who had read a sentence to the end before looking up. He thought about the young woman who had stopped scrolling. He thought about Robert Adeyemi sitting in the back of a courtroom in November, looking at the seal above the judge's bench. He thought about his daughter, who Calloway imagined was 9 years old, and doing her homework and not yet carrying what was coming. He closed the printed copy. He set it in his desk drawer. Outside the window, Washington was moving through a bright March morning, the kind of morning that feels provisional in the way early spring mornings do, aware of what is just behind them, tentatively oriented toward what is ahead. The city's bureaucratic machinery was moving at its ordinary pace. People walking to hearings and office buildings and subcommittee rooms with their briefcases and their lanyards and their particular purposes, the whole intricate, imperfect, still unfinished project of self-governance proceeding in the particular way it always proceeds, not smoothly, not inevitably, but forward. The work that remained was the larger category of everything the law could not fully reach, the assumptions lodged in reflexes and in habits, and in the accumulated sediment of decades of unchallengeable practice. Laws change behavior. They changed consequences. They changed what could be done and what could not. But they moved into territory that had been shaped by forces older than themselves, and the shaping left marks that the law could acknowledge but could not on its own erase. What erased it, Calloway believed, was the sustained, precise, unglamorous work of people who understood the difference between a system and the people inside it, and who did not accept, in either direction, the easy story. Not the story that the system was irredeemable, not the story that justice was automatic. The story in the middle, the harder one, the one that required showing up every morning and applying scrutiny, and building records and filing complaints and testifying in courtrooms and sitting in congressional hearings and reading legislation in print and marking the margins. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the calendar on his desk. He had a meeting at 9 and another at 11 and a call with the Oversight Board chairs in the afternoon. And then in the evening, he had a flight to Atlanta, personal time, visiting family, and he would move through the airport the way he always had, the way he always would, unhurried and quiet and carrying, as all of us carry, the full undiminished weight of who he was.